Mm-hmm.
Now, communicating to influence, much more effective when you can do this face to face. So here it's important to have a tailored message where you're trying to understand and then talk to your audience's needs, their interests, their attitudes. So if you're informing people, the emotional appeal is not really a part of it. But if you're trying to influence people to do something, having an emotional appeal where you're captivating your audience, you're eliciting emotions that will drive them to action, that's going to be much more effective. And here's where storytelling becomes important. You're using language, visuals, and effective storytelling to then get people to take action.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Your Customer, Your Success. My guest today is Digital Customer Experience Leader, Andrew Carothers. Andrew founded and helped build Cisco's CX function, has won a dozen international CX awards, and is a frequent speaker to CX and SaaS audiences. But we have a special focus for you here today. Andrew has a unique background in storytelling, and we're going to dedicate the entire episode to the art of storytelling. So you can take away a tangible action plan to make your discussions, your interactions, and your client experiences really stand out. So, Andrew, that is our plan, my man. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here. Love the pod.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the kind words, and I appreciate you being here. So, let's start with your quick background. What gives you this background in storytelling? I think you have a unique perspective. Why don't you share that with the audience?
Well, I have the unique perspective of having two tremendous storytelling mentors in my life. The first one was from just sort of the fortune of good birth, meaning my father. So my father was a Hollywood screenwriter, and most of the time when I was growing up, worked at home, and I adored my father. So I loved to go out into his office and just sort of watch him work. Now, most of the time he was writing on a yellow pad or typing. But what was most important and interesting to me was he would create storyboards and put them on the wall using 3x5 index cards. And I would watch him as he did that, and I would read them. And then at times, especially as I got to be a teenager, I would start to ask him about ideas, or even be so bold as to suggest ideas for stories he was working on. And then he would patiently explain why my idea didn't work. So why a particular idea I hadn't been set up earlier in the, so that the payoff would be there. So I really had this master class in storytelling for years under the wing of my storytelling father, who wrote movies and TV shows and plays. And so that was mentor number one. And mentor number two was in a business environment where just, again, got lucky. I had a mentor named Ted Michael. And a lot of people know the name, especially in tech public relations and tech marketing, of Regis McKenna. He was part of a firm called Michael McKenna, and Ted Michael was the Michael there. So he became my mentor in the business world. So this was one of the two guys, along with Regis McKenna, who put Silicon Valley on the map back in the 70s. And worked for Levi Strauss after that. And he was a master storyteller in the business context. So he helped me early on in my career really take kind of general storytelling techniques and apply them specifically to business. So based on that, and then through my own career, having honed through experience, I found two things. One, the ability to tell stories and really how to tell them, and sort of taking it not just the art of storytelling, but the science or the building blocks of storytelling, which is what I want to talk a little bit about today to try to teach people. And the second thing that I learned was it is a tremendously important skill, whether you, and I think one of the most important skills for people in all profession, especially in CX, where building relationships, working across companies, across silos, being the glue within a company is essential to the work that we do. I had a teacher in college for a English class. It was one of those, English 10 weeder classes type of thing. And he started off by saying, look, I know a lot of you people, first day of class, I know a lot of you are here because you need to take this class to be an English major. And I know a lot of your friends and your parents are going to ask you, why do you want to be an English major? What are you going to do besides, maybe teach? And he said, what's important for you to know is that what you're going to learn through this course and through the other courses in English is how to communicate. And no matter what you do in life, you need to be a good communicator. If you're a computer programmer, at some point, you're going to want to go talk to your boss to ask for a raise. You better be a good communicator. And that was another sort of aha light bulb moment for me about the power of storytelling.
That's interesting because that's, something my father always imparted on me. He was a lawyer and a brilliant lawyer and into logic. But he said to me, and I was just actually sharing this with my oldest, who's now a teenager, that you need to be able to communicate. You could be the smartest person in the world. If you can't get out what's in that brain of yours, it
Yeah.
doesn't do anybody any good. And so I've just been teaching my son the same thing. So that's interesting. So your dad did it with index cards and
Right.
no AI.
He was as old school as they come.
Right. So, geez, you could tell a story. You don't need AI. You could use your own brain for it.
Right,
That's
right.
interesting. Went low tech. It's great to hear. So that is great stuff, and we're looking forward to getting right into it. So I'm going to turn it over to you in a second. But from what I understand, is this all starts with having a clear purpose, correct?
Correct. It's really like anything else in life. If you're more likely to get to where you want to go. If you're going to go to a restaurant, for example, you're more likely to get there efficiently and effectively if you know where you're going.
Hmm.
So in storytelling, you need to understand the purpose of your communication. So whether that communication is written communication, whether it's a PowerPoint presentation you're going to send to somebody, whether it's a speech you're giving, a voicemail, a tech, whatever it might be, understanding, especially for more important communication, right, where the stakes are higher, understanding whether you want to either inform somebody or influence something, right? So that's where it starts from. Am I trying to inform or influence in this communication? And if you're trying to inform, right, that's where you're transferring information. So think of newspapers, news stories, not op-eds, or textbooks, where things like transparency and honesty and delivering that information are important, right? So that you're seen as an honest narrator. It's education oriented, right? Where you're focusing on educating the audience on specific subjects. So think of a history teacher, where sharing information about what happened and when, etc. Being factually accurate, again, along with the transparency, is important because you need to be seen as not only an honest narrator, but sharing information that people can trust. So that's what's important about communicating to inform. And oftentimes that can take the place of an email, right? You don't
Hmm.
need to have face-to-face meetings for that.
Hmm.
Now, communicating to influence, much more effective when you can do this face to face. This is where you're trying to move ideas into action. You're trying to persuade people, motivate them. You're trying to change their behavior. So here it's important to have a tailored message where you're trying to understand and then talk to your audience's needs, their interests, their attitudes. You want to have a call to action because you're trying to motivate behavior. So what are you trying to encourage the audience to do? And you're much more likely to be effective if you have an emotional appeal. So if you're informing people, the emotional appeal is not really a part of it. But if you're trying to influence people to do something, having an emotional appeal where you're captivating your audience, you're eliciting emotions that will drive them to action, that's going to be much more effective. And here's where storytelling becomes important. You're using language, visuals, and effective storytelling to then get people to take action.
So that's interesting. You said something in the beginning that caught my attention. So it's almost a little bit like it's the difference between the front page and the editorial page,
Yes.
right? So the first, so inform is the front page and the influence is the editorial page when you're really trying to move someone to your idea, your political view, or whatever the heck it is. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so I think so. Do you think a lot of people just totally miss that when they're starting? They're not thinking through that step. Just get it right off the bat.
Yeah, I do. I do. I think this is where I think it's more common for people to sit down with a blank piece of paper or PowerPoint or whatever their medium is and kind of stay. This is where the whole concept of writer's block and I don't know how to get started and it takes me so long because people are sort of waiting for the art of storytelling. They're waiting for inspiration to strike. and then they can write down their thoughts. I think that the better approach is to have that clear purpose. And now we're getting into sort of the science of storytelling and structuring an argument. Because really, communicating to influence is making an argument to get people to do something. And once you figure it out, all right, let's focus in on the influencing, because this is where the storytelling comes in. So once you've decided I want to influence somebody, and then the next step is to figure out the next level of your purpose, which is, what do I want my audience to do as a result of my communication? And this could be an audience of 1,000. This could be an audience of 1. So what do I want my audience specifically to think, feel, or do? And it could be multiples of that, right? So, for example, I want my audience to think that I want them to agree with my point of view on a particular topic. Mm-hmm. Or I want them to think that I have the capabilities to do something. Maybe I want them to feel something. I want them to feel confidence in my abilities. I want them to feel urgency that action needs to be taken. And what do I want them to do? And that could be, I want them to join me in the crusade. I want them to go on a walk with me outside. I want them to provide resources for what I'm trying to do. I want them to whisper in the ear of executives to provide support. So think, feel, or do. What do I want my audience to think, feel, or do? Now I'm ready to start kind of mapping out my story. And so we're really talking about building out the structure of storytelling. We're the architects of stories, as opposed to not really understanding what we're trying to do. And then we're just staring at the blank page for a couple hours.
So we're talking step 2 is basically building your argument. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So we know what we want to argue, like we know what we're trying to do here.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what we want our audience, like we know what the end game is, what we want our audience to think, feel, and or do by the time they've heard our argument. So then we move into building out the argument. And there's a really good technique for doing this, right? For blocking out the argument. And it's where you map out, like set the context and then provide the core message. So you set out the context, which is really the problem statement. And then the core message is your solution. So take that context and break it down even more into 3 building blocks of that, right? What's the situation?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening? What's the complication, right? Why is that a problem? So the situation is, what's the problem? And the complication is, why is that a problem? And then the third one is implication. So what's the impact of that problem? So I'll give you a quick example of that. We know that the CX world has seen a lot of shrinking over the last few years. And so a lot of people may be looking for a job. So I thought it might be valuable to use that as an example.
Sure.
So if I'm interviewing for a job and I'm a CX expert, in particular, digital customer experience expert. So I might go into a job interview and talk about, the situation, right? What's the problem? Is the company I'm interviewing with needs to grow revenue and they need to grow earnings, right? So they need to grow revenue and they need to reduce costs so they can increase earnings. But I also know that they don't have CSM coverage for a material percentage of their accounts. Let's call it 20%. So that's the situation. They need to grow revenue. They also don't have 20%, coverage, or 20% of their accounts covered, right? So that's the problem. But now I need to explain, so why is that a problem, right? Well, the renewal rates are lower than industry average. They can't afford to hire more CSMs to cover more of their accounts. They don't have in-house knowledge for a digital CX strategy. So now getting into okay, here's the problem, here's the complication. And by the way, all the time I'm setting up this argument, I'm also showing my knowledge of that company and their problems, which is, another feather in my cap.
Mm-hmm.
So then what's the implication of that, right? What's the impact of that problem? And bottom line, that company is missing the pieces that they need to deliver on their business strategy as that strategy was laid out by the board or the CEO or whatever. So I would know all this from having done my research about the company in advance. But here rather than just jumping into a job interview and talking about my resume and what I've done, and, I'm really laying out the beginnings of an argument of, here's the problem statement. Now the solution is hire me. So Now let's get into the second part of this process, right? Laying out the core message or the solution. So 3 parts again: position, action, benefit. So the position is, what's my stance? Right? What do I want to have happen? What new situation am I trying to create? And then the action is, what do I want the person that I'm talking to or the group or whatever it is, like what action do I want them to take? This is the call to action that I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
And then the benefit is, what benefit will derive to them, right? So it's not benefit to me, it's to them. So here's what I think should happen. Here's the action I think they should take to make it happen. And here's what they get in return.
Mm-hmm.
So back to my example, I've laid out the problem statement for the company. And then the position that I then take is that digital CX strategy will address their needs cost effectively. It'll help them increase renewals and grow upsell and cross-sell revenue. It'll reduce costs via self-service options. They'll be able to leverage AI in a way that they're not already. And then the action is, hire me to implement that digital CX strategy. I have the knowledge and experience. I've been involved in digital CX for 15 years. As you mentioned at the top, I was one of the founders of Cisco's CX strategy, right? So a little bit of my bona fides. And then the benefit is that it will help address their business needs. And if I can get specific, then all the better, right? So
Right.
I'll be able to help grow their revenue by up to, 15%, as I did at Cisco, and renewals up to 20%, again, as I did at Cisco, reduce costs, and I'll be able to connect silos across the company. So a little sort of soft one there.
Right.
So my job interview has just gone from sort of the standard approach, which is, well, let me walk through my resume, try to make a connection with the interviewer, hope for the best, to that interviewer walking away from interviewing me being wowed, being like, wow, this guy really knows how to make a convincing argument. And even if they're not thinking that way, they're walking away thinking, I got to hire this guy. He understands our business. He understands the problem I'm trying to solve. He can solve it. Oh, like, I don't think most job interviews people walk away with that solid of an impression. And
Right.
for folks who are looking for a job, this is the way to make that impression and make it solid and effective.
That is so interesting, because I'm thinking this more in terms of a business presentation, but you just put that in the context of job interviewing. I think that's incredibly beneficial for folks out there, because we certainly know there's a lot of people impacted by layoffs and such over the past year or so. But I never thought of it in that regard. So that's an extra bonus. That is brilliant stuff. If you think about it, right, because you get kind of stuck in that morass of the job interview. Tell me about your background. Tell me, and it's you feel like it's so boring. You're trying to make an impression. What a great way to make an impression. That is great stuff. Awesome. So let's kind of do this in summary, if you could. You basically, you start with the inform or influence, right? The purpose. Take me through it, and then it's build the argument, and then you kind of, now we don't have the visual here because this is audio and a video podcast, but you basically storyboard this stuff, and
Right.
we didn't want to confuse anybody and put the storyboard up, but you have all this in a presentation handy that you could share if needed. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So once you've again started off with, the purpose of my argument is to influence, and here's what I want my audience to think and or feel and or do, and then I'm going to take that and sort of the building block, and then I'm going to add on, if I'm an architect, I'm now adding on the situation, complication, implication, position, action, benefit. Right? Those are the framing of the house. Then I'm going to finish the structure with the storyboard. So this is going back to, when I'm 13 years old and I'm in my dad's office and he's got 3x5 index cards on the wall. It's 2025, so we're not doing it that way anymore. I actually do this in PowerPoint. You can do this in Word. You do, again, in whatever medium you want. And I actually take boxes and I make them yellow boxes because it reminds me of yellow sticky notes. And I have I kind of map out. It's another way to outline the story. So if you just want to do a traditional outline, that's fine too. But I'll map out the different chapters of my story. So, which is pretty much the SIPAB that I mentioned before: position, situation, complication, implication, etc. And I'll map those out and just put them in a line, which becomes a left-hand column on my piece of paper.
Hmm.
And then for each one of those, now I'm fleshing out my argument here with the storyboard. So I'll have maybe the first part of that, and then I'll have a row that comes on it with more detail. So let me just give a very specific example from not from the job interview perspective, but from a real case work example. So when I was at Cisco, we oftentimes, like many CX professionals, find ourselves wanting to get more resources, whether that be headcount or dollars or whatever it might be. So we would go to our stakeholders and we would talk about, we would go and request their assistance. And that might be to, whisper in somebody's ear. That might be to provide funding from their budget, whatever it might be. We didn't just go in and say, hey, here's who we are. How about you fund us? Rather, we told a story, starting off with what's the digital customer experience imperative. To be clear, I was on the digital customer experience team.
Hmm.
What's the imperative, generally speaking? Who is the digital customer experience team at Cisco? What capabilities do we bring? And then what's the benefit of collaborating with us?
Hmm.
So that's sort of the left-hand column on a page, or the chapters of the book that's the story I'm trying to tell. And then I would go through each one of those chapters in more detail, right? So what's the digital customer experience imperative in the world today, right? So this is not specific to Cisco, but customer expectations, customers expect a personalized, relevant experience, et cetera, et cetera. What's the impact of that? Well, customers will change vendors if they don't get it. What are the qualities of a digital customer experience? Like, what do we know? What does it need to be? Simple, consistent, connected, et cetera. And then what's the reality of Cisco today, right? It's not.
Right.
So I would go through each of that. And as I would lay out this storyboard, this gave me a visual on one page to be able to look at my story and see, am I telling this in the most impactful way? Maybe I should move the chapters around in their order. Maybe I should take information and cut it out of the story or add additional stuff. And I would do all these sticky notes in yellow. Now I'm saying sticky, it's again, they're boxes on a PowerPoint.
Hmm.
But then I would add in a different color what I call color spots. And these are things to bring the story to life. It might be an anecdote.
Hmm.
So it might be, for example, a customer quote that's really powerful, saying, your guys' customer experience stinks. Or it might be a data point from Forrester or Gartner or an analyst research firm, right? That really brings something home. So the little, now we're bringing in sort of key elements that make the story pop. And again, I can look at this and structure it all on one page. Now, once I'm finished with that, I've got a powerful storyboard structured for influence with different elements of story that are going to make it really pop and make it memorable. This is where I'm bringing in emotional appeal through stories and things like that. So
Hmm.
that's how I take the initial, this is the science of storytelling, starting off from, hey, am I trying to inform to influence, to then building out, what do I want them to think, feel, or do, to then building out the SIPAB component, the situation and the action plan, and then really fleshing that out. Now we've got a full house ready to sell. And I want to add one other element to
Yeah.
this, right? When you're thinking about those color spots, right, to bring in emotional appeal, because it is important in influence when we're talking about influencing people to appeal emotionally. Bring in an element of vision. So I'll give you two examples.
Hmm.
Workplace example. When a lot of people, employee relations is a critical element at this point to retain and motivate quality employees. So giving your team a vision for what they can be, and then if possible, visually representing that vision. So for example, when we were trying to motivate my team, put together a presentation that included a slide that said, this is where we want the industry to be telling the story about us in a few years. We mocked up a Harvard Business Review cover, right, with focusing in on the story of Cisco's digital customer experience. We mocked up different examples of, a book being sold on Amazon, press releases, awards, all that kind of stuff, so that they could visualize what success would be like. They were ready to charge the highest mountain with us. They were so motivated by seeing the vision. And I'll give you one more personal example of storytelling, of selling the vision, of creating the vision. When I first started dating my wife, I was trying to convince her to date me, and she wouldn't date me for a variety of reasons. But so I sat down with her and I said, think about this. Think about we start dating. We hit it off. We go on more dates. We end up, we were in college at the time, and she was in a sorority. I was in a fraternity. So I said, we ended up getting pinned. And then I continued to tell the story. We get married, we have kids, and I ended it with, and we grow old on the porch, rocking in the chairs, watching our grandkids grow up. And then, so I now set it up, and then the emotional appeal, think of what you might miss.
Mm.
And she thought about that, and she said, I talked to her about it later. She's like, you know what? I don't think this is the guy, but why not take a chance? Because what might I miss? And I ended up being the guy. But the point was, she never would have dated me had I not given the vision of what her future could look like, potentially, if she, by dating me. So giving the vision for the result, for the benefit, so that your audience can really visualize that is incredibly powerful.
That is amazing. So, at first I was going to say it's very inspiring because you don't think of telling the story for something other maybe than to sell or win business. And you're taught that maybe in sales, but never on the influence side in the organization, which is what you laid out to us. But then couple that with finding a spouse. I mean, you're talking about, this is your customer success. Now we give financial sometimes advice and leadership advice. Now we're giving relationship advice. So there you go. Your customer success is covering all the bases for you.
Yeah.
That's great.
Stakes were high.
That is a great story. So thank you for telling that story. So, all right. So let's have some of it because that's a lot. And once again, this visually makes even more sense when you see it. So, we can share the kind of outline for you if you like, and we'll talk about that at the end of the episode. But let's have some fun with it now. Let's talk about some people you think are great storytellers, business or otherwise.
Sure. So, good comedians need to be great storytellers because they need to set up a joke. They need to bring the audience along, especially sometimes, they're doing a 30-minute set, or you see some of these specials on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
And they'll tell a joke at the beginning, and then they'll come back to it and sort of reference it later, right? That's all part of the storytelling. So think of people like George Carlin, Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah.
Right? These are really good storytellers because they get you to a point where when they tell the punchline, they've set you up through their storytelling. So I think comedians need to be really good storytellers. You think about politicians, and they need to create an emotional connection. Ronald Reagan is the classic example of a great storyteller when it comes to politics. Songwriters, right? So songwriters need to be really strong storytellers, right? To whether it even just be sort of a catchy pop song like a Taylor Swift, or something with more, political and sort of societal cultural impact like a Kendrick Lamar, or like going a little bit old school here, a James Taylor or a Paul Simon. You think of the song America by Simon and Garfunkel, and the story that tells, like tremendous storytellers there. And here's a twist that I like a lot. I love history. And I know a lot of people don't. They think, well, it's just dates and events and it's boring. Good history teachers tell really good stories. So if they're trying to inform, right, that's just dates and events and et cetera. So that's fine. That's important. But if they're trying to influence people to understand the meaning of these dates, et cetera, that could be hugely important. So there's a really popular history podcast for all the history nerds out there called The Rest is History. And the storytelling in that show is fantastic, whether they're talking about the lead up to the Battle of Hastings, or they're talking about the Reagan presidency, or whatever it might be, to be able to tell the impact and the societal influence moving, that stems from things. So history teachers and any teacher for that matter can be really great storytellers.
That's amazing. And you hit on a few people that I was thinking. I was thinking George Carlin myself. He was absolutely a master, just a master at his craft. And certainly Seinfeld. I think Cosby as well. And can you say Cosby anymore? I don't, right? So, but forget it. But on stage, he was a master. Certainly, in my day, that was growing up. He was huge with a couple of his show, etc. Which reminds me, actually, speaking of telling stories, the Hollywood connection on this podcast is pretty funny. My guest Tim McCleary a couple episodes ago worked for NBC and Universal, and he worked on the set of Cheers. And I did not know that before the episode, which is probably good because I would have talked the whole episode about Cheers with him because that is my favorite show ever. But talk about telling a story. Cheers, I think, is one of the shows that you look to because they did, a lot of sitcoms were basically episode by episode by episode. And there wasn't a common thread other than kind of the usual, inside jokes and things like that. But Cheers told you a story. It was Sam and Diane. The relationship started, the relationship ended. The relationship started, the relationship ended. Carla was pregnant again, the on and again, off again. Relationship with Sam, and then Shelley Long left the show, and then you had Kirstie Alley and that character come in, and the whole and unfortunately Nicholas Colasanto, coach, passed away after the second season. You brought in Woody, but these stories kept going with Frasier and Lilith, and you had this common thread of the following these people's lives through the show, which you didn't really see in sitcoms. And I think
Exactly. And I think that's why you think of the sitcoms that had cultural impact at the time and decades later. We're still talking about Cheers, Seinfeld, MASH, right?
Yeah.
These shows, Sopranos was decades ago, but we still talk about it. Not a sitcom, of course. I guarantee you, the writers sat down before a season and mapped out the story arc for that season, if not multiple seasons. And then for each episode, they sat down and followed essentially this type of storyboarding process that we've been talking about today. They followed the same process so that when an episode was over, people had laughed, but they'd also had an emotional connection to the storyline, to a character, whatever it might be. And by the time the show was over, people, audience members, felt a loss, like something had been taken away from them that they had an emotional connection to. Mm-hmm. Because the writers didn't just sit down and say, all right, this is a story of, we're going to tell some jokes in a bar context and, call it a day. They sat down and told stories.
And they really did. And then, now Seinfeld, there was no learning. You were not allowed to remember. That was the thing, but that was like the kind of anti-story thing. But that was the story, which just phenomenal. So interesting stuff. So that is a great way to think of it and really conceptualize what we're trying to do here. But it's the same technique that you're espousing to use in a business framework.
Yes,
brilliant stuff. All right, everybody, we're going to move to the segments. We are going to go with Does It Hold Water, my favorite segment. First, Does It Hold Water is where I ask my guest to be our resident expert witness for the day. I'm going to read a quote from a thought leader, and my guest is going to agree, disagree, see if it holds water, why or why not. Are you ready?
I love this. Yeah, let's go.
We're going Hollywood, okay? And I cannot do this justice because the actor who recited this speech was marvelous. And the quote comes from the last speech of Tyrion Lannister in Game of Thrones. Peter Dinklage, I'm sorry, but I'm going to do my best. Are you ready? In his last speech, he says, "What unites people? Armies? Gold? Flags? No, it's stories. There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it."
I'm going to say holds water.
I know, absolutely. But I said that is just a great one to throw in there. Awesome, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, think of it this way. Tell me a fact. There's an old adage. Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it'll live in my heart forever.
Brilliant. I thought this was a good one. Obviously, you would agree with it, but I mean, what he's saying here is there's nothing more powerful than a good story. No
Yeah.
army, etc. Pretty interesting way to end it. I don't know that most people would think of it that way, but when you really think of it, maybe he's right.
I think he's absolutely right. I think, you know, you remember the old Who song of, with the line around, or meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So armies, flags, whatever, they may, you may be able to buy people with gold temporarily. The gold runs out, or people always want more. You may be able to subdue people with armies, but that doesn't mean you've won them over. There still might be resistance. And same thing with flags, with nationalism. But you tell them a story and you get them to believe in an idea, or in you as an executor of that idea. Now you've got them forever.
Brilliant. No, agreed. Wonderful stuff. All right, now let's move over to chip shots. Chip shots are fun, yet still professional, more conversational, short form questions. We try to go to 3 to 4 that I think will be interesting, fun. And we're going to start with the book question. We've got a great book list going. Can you give us one book that has significantly influenced your professional or personal life?
Sure. And I'm going to give you two: one personal, one professional. So professional, we'll start with that. There's a great book by Thomas Law and J.B. Wood of TSIA, the Technology Services Industry Association. It's called Digital Hesitation. Came out a couple of years ago, and it really lays out the why and the how of digital customer experience. So I think digital customer experience is critical for every organization. So I would recommend that everybody in every industry read Digital Hesitation. So that's one book. On a personal level, one of the books that's influenced me the most in my life, I've read it many times, starting shockingly in elementary school, and then in high school, and then in college, and then as an adult, is Frankenstein.
Really?
This story of not judging a book by its cover, the story of othering people and the impact of that, the story of empathy or lack thereof. I think it's such an interesting plot line, but I think it's so powerful from an emotional standpoint and resonates from generation to generation.
That's an interesting one. And you just made Chris Hood, my guest on episode 10, very happy because he mentioned nothing but fiction books and has basically every monster book
Yeah. Yeah.
ever written as his.
Dracula would be another one, very
Yep.
similar concepts.
Interesting. Great stuff. Good ones. All right. Let's move to the shadowing a leader question. I love this one. If you could spend the day shadowing a leader, professional in any industry, who would it be and what would you hope to learn?
Boy, if I could, I would be shadowing my dad from a storytelling perspective.
Right.
And as an adult and firmly set in my career, to be able to, I would get so much more out of those conversations to really understand. And he told me a little bit about the inner workings, not just of storytelling, but of Hollywood and the conversations he had with studio executives, actors and directors, etc. But again, to be able to have those conversations now with the level of knowledge I have and to be able to apply that to my career, that would be phenomenally valuable.
Is there anything you could share that he worked on that people would know?
Sure. I mean, if you're a certain age, movies like The Secret of My Success with Michael J. Fox.
Yeah.
Hero at Large with John Ritter. He worked very closely with Disney right before and up until and then after Disney died. In fact, if you ever come to San Francisco, in the Presidio, there is a Walt Disney Museum, and you'll see video of my dad in there talking about the impact of employees at the studio when Disney died. So he made a number of Disney films, Emil the Detective, Miracle of the White Stallions, etc. And then he had a very popular TV series that he created and wrote a number of them called Nanny the Professor. So
yeah,
a bunch of things like that.
That is really cool. That is great stuff. Awesome. All right. Thank you for sharing that. So we're gonna go with wait a second, my bad. I'm skipping a question. We're gonna go with the is there a particular experience or failure early in your career that taught you a valuable lesson?
Yeah. So beginning of my career, I was working in a PR agency, and I had always worked really well on deadline. And that became my default habit. So one time I waited, I procrastinated until the deadline hit, and then I scrambled and tried to make the diving catch, and I didn't catch it. Right. So my boss pulled me over and was like, I see how you work. And that's not a strong way to work, right? You're setting yourself up for potential failure. Don't take the risk in the future. And I was like, oh, she's right. So that was hugely impactful for me to break the habit early on of waiting until the last minute to get something done. It had always worked in school, etc., but it doesn't always work. So I learned my lesson early, thankfully.
Yeah, especially when you're involved in client and customer experience, that is not
Yes,
a wise path. But that's funny. I was thinking the same thing. School, everybody waits the last minute for the paper to study, and it doesn't work. It's just, especially as you get older, it is not good for your stress and your anxiety levels. It is
exactly.
not a way
Exactly.
to proceed in your career. So, any young, early career young people listening to that, take that to heart, please. It gets much more harder as you go along. Speaking of which, there are certain things we do every day to keep those anxiety levels down. What is one habit or routine that you've cultivated over the years that believes contributes to your personal or professional success?
So one thing that I've turned into a habit is travel,
Hmm.
and two ways. One, sort of short trips to whether it be a weekend away somewhere, or traveling to Dallas to see a good friend, whatever it might be. But also, and this is internet. I love international travel. So this gives me the opportunity to take 2 or even 3 weeks on a trip and enjoy that, and just get completely away from the day to day stress, from the stress of work, from the stress of the household, whatever it might be, because I'm off immersed every day in new things, the Basque country, Romania,
Wow.
Bulgaria, London, whatever it might be. But just as valuable than those 3 weeks of the actual trip is all the time in advance planning it, right? The
Hmm.
months in advance where I'm thinking about where do I want to go and what are we going to do, and planning out the trip and what we're going to see and all that. And then there's the afterglow, right after the 3 weeks is over, where I'm thinking about that for months afterward and getting the sort of the endorphins firing as
Hmm.
I think about the experience. So the pre-planning and the post-trip are as valuable when it comes to the stress relief as the actual 2 3 week trip itself.
That is great stuff. And that is why you've been on Rick Denton's CX Passport twice. Because Rick was my first guest, but if anybody doesn't know, please do tune into Rick's CX Passport. He asks questions about travel. That's his talk at the end,
Yeah.
and asks you where you'd like to go, where you've been. And of course, my answer to where his question to me, I think he asked you the same thing: is where'd you like to return to
Yes.
again? And to me, it was Pebble Beach. It was California, out your way, a little bit south of where you are, I think.
Yeah.
But I had not played the golf course. It was when I just started to get into golf, and so that was where I told him I'd like to go back to. Not as exciting as the Basque Country or all around the world like you are, but that's what I gave Rick. But that is cool stuff. Um,
Yeah.
awesome. So let me ask you to let the audience know where they could reach you to find out more about you or get more information, or get this kind of picture of how to do this holistically, in a kind of tangible format.
So the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. The address never changes. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. And I mean that. I'm not just sort of throwing that out, but I mean that. Connect with me, have conversations with me. I'm more than happy to talk, to connect there and talk to people offline to share what I've learned about storytelling or customer experience writ large, or digital customer experience. I love to connect with people. Best way to start with that is on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And that goes for me as well, certainly. So I want to thank you, Andrew. You've been a tremendous guest. I think this is going to be a super helpful episode. Like I said, I started off when I was talking to you earlier about I got to go general to start, and then now I've been getting very specific on things. And I think this was a great and very unique, specific episode that will benefit a lot of people. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks, Gary. It was such a pleasure, and I hope folks find this valuable.
Yeah, they certainly will. So thank you all for joining us, and I will be back more soon with more guests from the world of CX, customer success, and leadership, and more. So thank you for joining us, and bye for now. That's a wrap. thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope you found something insightful that will enhance your experiences and drive your success. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review and share your thoughts to help us improve the show. Don't forget to head on over to marracxhub.com for more ways to connect with me and learn more about experience management. Until next time, I'm Gary Marra, working hard for your customer and your success.